Our voyage to Iceland. The hour of departure came at last. The night before, the worthy Mr. Thompson brought us the most cordial letters of introduction for Baron Tramp, Governor of Iceland, for M. Picterson, coadjutor to the bishop, and for M. Finson, mayor of the town of Reykjavik. In return, my uncle nearly crushed his hands, so warmly did he shake them. On the 2nd of the month, at 2 in the morning, our precious cargo of luggage was taken on board the good ship Valkyrie. We followed, and were very politely introduced by the captain to a small cabin with 2 standing bed places, neither very well ventilated nor very comfortable. But in the cause of science men are expected to suffer. Well, and have we a fair wind? Cried my uncle, in his most mellifluous accents. An excellent wind, replied Captain Jarn. We shall leave the Sound, going free with all sails set. A few minutes afterwards, the schooner started before the wind, under all the canvas she could carry, and entered the channel. An hour later, the capital of Denmark seemed to sink into the waves, and we were at no great distance from the coast of Elsinore. My uncle was delighted. For myself, moody and dissatisfied, I appeared almost to expect a glimpse of the ghost of Hamlet. Sublime madman, thought I, you doubtless would approve our proceedings. You might perhaps even follow us to the center of the earth, there to resolve your eternal doubts. But no ghost or anything else appeared upon the ancient walls. The fact is, the castle is much later than the time of the heroic Prince of Denmark. It is now the residence of the keeper of the Strait of the Sound, and through that sound more than 15,000 vessels of all nations pass every year. The castle of Kronborg soon disappeared in the murky atmosphere, as well as the Tower of Helsingborg, which raises its head on the Swedish bank. And here the schooner began to feel in earnest the breezes of the Kattegat. The Valkyrie was swift enough, but with all sailing boats there is the same uncertainty. Her cargo was coal, furniture, pottery, woolen clothing, and a load of corn. As usual, the crew was small, 5 Danes doing the whole of the work. How long will the voyage last? Asked my uncle. Well, I should think about 10 days, replied the skipper, unless, indeed, we meet with some northeast gales among the Faroe Islands. At all events, there will be no very considerable delay, cried the impatient professor. No, Mr. Hardwigg, said the captain, no fear of that. At all events, we shall get there some day. Towards evening the schooner doubled Cape Skagen, the northernmost part of Denmark, crossed the Skagerrak during the night, skirted the extreme point of Norway through the gut of Cape Lindesnes, and then reached the northern seas. 2 days later we were not far from the coast of Scotland, somewhere near what Danish sailors call Peterhead, and then the Valkyrie stretched out direct for the Faroe Islands, between Orkney and Shetland. Our vessel now felt the full force of the ocean waves, and the wind shifting. We with great difficulty made the Faroe Isles. On the 8th day, the captain made out Mygenness, the westernmost of the isles, and from that moment headed direct for Portland, a cape on the southern shores of the singular island for which we were bound. The voyage offered no incident worthy of record. I bore it very well, but my uncle, to his great annoyance, and even shame, was remarkably seasick. This mal de mer troubled him the more that it prevented him from questioning Captain Jarn as to the subject of Sneffels, as to the means of communication, and the facilities of transport. All these explanations he had to adjourn to the period of his arrival. His time, meanwhile, was spent lying in bed groaning, and dwelling anxiously on the hoped-for termination of the voyage. I didn't pity him. On the 11th day we sighted Cape Portland, over which towered Mount Mordal's yokel, which, the weather being clear, we made out very readily. The cape itself is nothing but a huge mount of granite standing naked, and alone to meet the Atlantic waves. The Valkyrie kept off the coast, steering to the westward. On all sides were to be seen whole schools of whales and sharks. After some hours we came in sight of a solitary rock in the ocean, forming a mighty vault, through which the foaming waves poured with intense fury. The islets of Westman appeared to leap from the ocean, being so low in the water as scarcely to be seen until you were right upon them. From that moment the schooner was steered to the westward in order to round Cape Reykjanes, the western point of Iceland. My uncle, to his great disgust, was unable even to crawl on deck, so heavy a sea was on, and thus lost the first view of the land of promise. 48 hours later, after a storm which drove us far to sea under bare poles, we came once more in sight of land, and were boarded by a pilot, who, after 3 hours of dangerous navigation, brought the schooner safely to an anchor in the Bay of Faxa before Reykjavik. My uncle came out of his cabin pale, haggard, thin, but full of enthusiasm, his eyes dilated with pleasure and satisfaction. Nearly the whole population of the town was on foot to see us land. The fact was, that scarcely any one of them, but expected some goods by the periodical vessel. Professor Hardwigg was in haste to leave his prison, or rather as he called it, his hospital, but before he attempted to do so, he caught hold of my hand, led me to the quarterdeck of the schooner, took my arm with his left hand, and pointed inland with his right, over the northern part of the bay, to where rose a high two-peaked mountain, a double cone covered with eternal snow. "Behold," he whispered in an awe-stricken voice, "behold Mount Sneffels." Then without further remark, he put his finger to his lips, frowned darkly, and descended into the small boat which awaited us. I followed, and in a few minutes we stood upon the soil of mysterious Iceland. Scarcely were we fairly on shore when there appeared before us a man of excellent appearance, wearing the costume of a military officer. He was, however, but a civil servant, a magistrate, the governor of the island Baron Tramp. The professor knew whom he had to deal with. He therefore handed him the letters from Copenhagen, and a brief conversation in Danish followed, to which I of course was a stranger, and for a very good reason, for I did not know the language in which they conversed. I afterwards heard, however, that Baron Tramp placed himself entirely at the beck and call of Professor Hardwigg. My uncle was most graciously received by M. Finson, the mayor, who as far as costume went, was quite as military as the governor, but also from character and occupation quite as pacific. As for his coadjutor, M. Picterson, he was absent on an episcopal visit to the northern portion of the diocese. We were therefore compelled to defer the pleasure of being presented to him. His absence was, however, more than compensated by the presence of M. Fridriksson, professor of natural science in the College of Reykjavik, a man of invaluable ability. This modest scholar spoke no languages save Icelandic and Latin. When, therefore, he addressed himself to me in the language of Horace, we at once came to understand one another. He was, in fact, the only person that I did thoroughly understand during the whole period of my residence in this benighted island. Out of 3 rooms of which his house was composed, 2 were placed at our service, and in a few hours we were installed with all our baggage, the amount of which rather astonished the simple inhabitants of Reykjavik. "Now, Harry," said my uncle, rubbing his hands, "and goes well. The worst difficulty is now over." "How the worst difficulty over?" I cried in fresh amazement. "Doubtless. Here we are in Iceland. Nothing more remains but to descend into the bowels of the earth." "Well, sir, to a certain extent you are right. We have only to go down, but, as far as I am concerned, that is not the question. I want to know how we are to get up again. That is the least part of the business, and does not in any way trouble me. In the meantime, there is not an hour to lose. I am about to visit the public library. Very likely I may find there some manuscripts from the hand of Saknussemm. I shall be glad to consult them. In the meanwhile, I replied, I will take a walk through the town. Will you not likewise do so? I feel no interest in the subject, said my uncle. What for me is curious in this island, is not what is above the surface, but what is below. I bowed by way of reply, put on my hat and furred cloak, and went out. It was not an easy matter to lose oneself in the 2 streets of Reykjavik. I had therefore no need to ask my way. The town lies on a flat and marshy plain, between 2 hills. A vast field of lava skirts it on one side, falling away in terraces towards the sea. On the other hand is the large bay of Faxa, bordered on the north by the enormous glacier of Sneffels, and in which bay the Valkyrie was then the only vessel at anchor. Generally there were 1 or 2 English or French gunboats, to watch and protect the fisheries in the offing. They were now, however, absent on duty. The longest of the streets of Reykjavik runs parallel to the shore. In this street the merchants and traders live in wooden huts made with beams of wood, painted red mere log huts, such as you find in the wilds of America. The other street, situated more to the west, runs toward a little lake between the residences of the bishop and the other personages not engaged in commerce. I had soon seen all I wanted of these weary and dismal thoroughfares. Here and there was a strip of discolored turf, like an old worn-out bit of woolen carpet, and now and then a bit of kitchen garden, in which grew potatoes, cabbage, and lettuce, almost diminutive enough to suggest the idea of Lilliput. In the center of the new commercial street, I found the public cemetery, enclosed by an earthen wall. Though not very large, it appeared not likely to be filled for centuries. From hence I went to the house of the governor, a mere hut in comparison with the mansion house of Hamburg, but a palace alongside the other Icelandic houses. Between the little lake and the town was the church, built in simple Protestant style, and composed of calcined stones, thrown up by volcanic action. I have not the slightest doubt that in high winds its red tiles were blown out, to the great annoyance of the pastor and congregation. Upon an eminence close at hand was the National School, in which were taught Hebrew, English, French, and Danish. In 3 hours my tour was complete. The general impression upon my mind was sadness. No trees, no vegetation, so to speak, on all sides volcanic peaks, the huts of turf and earth more like roofs than houses. Thanks to the heat of these residences, grass grows on the roof, which grass is carefully cut for hay. I saw but few inhabitants during my excursion, but I met a crowd on the beach, drying, salting, and loading codfish, the principal article of exportation. The men appeared robust, but heavy, fair-haired like Germans, but of pensive mien, exiles of a higher scale in the ladder of humanity than the Eskimos, but, I thought, much more unhappy, since with superior perceptions they are compelled to live within the limits of the polar circle. Sometimes they gave vent to a convulsive laugh, but by no chance did they smile. Their costume consists of a coarse capote of black wool, known in Scandinavian countries as the vadmal, a broad-brimmed hat, trousers of red serge, and a piece of leather tied with strings for a shoe, a coarse kind of moccasin. The women, though sad-looking and mournful, had rather agreeable features, without much expression. They wore a bodice and petticoat of somber vadmal. When unmarried they wear a little brown knitted cap over a crown of plaited hair, but when married, they cover their heads with a colored handkerchief, over which they tie a white scarf.